All right, so who am I? I am Catherine. I am CPWA, ADS, and ADAC certified. So that means I've been through a lot of IAAP exams, both the CPAC, the WAS, and the Accessible Document Specialist exams. And I've also gotten my ADA coordinator certification, because I think it's really important for us to consider all aspects of accessibility, even though I tend to specialize in digital. I've been working in accessibility for over 10 years, and most recently, I've been at University of Connecticut at DQ, who is, of course, our host, and at Travelers. And I have papers on personas, accessibility testing tools, digital accessibility programs. I've gotten the opportunity to take part in a lot of different parts of this industry, and it's been a really exciting journey. I picked my tagline kind of strategically. So I said, making accessibility accessible, because we talk a lot about making our products accessible, whether it's our websites, our apps, our kiosks. But one of the challenges that I see is in making the information that we give to people a little bit easier to grasp. People are really at the root of making accessibility happen. So how can we make the learning journey easier for them? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So my intro slide says, effective accessibility champion equals change management practitioner. And change management, you're going to find, is a theme throughout today's talk. Most of the time, you're not going to be working with newly formed teams that are new to Agile and new to your company and new to development. We almost always seem to get dropped into the middle of situations when working with development teams. It seems to me that the norm is accessibility professionals get brought in towards the end of the development lifecycle, where we say, hey, we're going to launch in a week. We should probably get accessibility to review this. And then there won't be any defects, so we'll be good to launch. That's almost never the case. We always find accessibility issues. So the default, then, the mindset that you as the accessibility professional comes in with is that you introducing accessibility is going to disrupt business or development as usual. Therefore, to be an effective accessibility champion, you have to be a change management practitioner. So what is change management? The big idea behind change management is that you are introducing a new idea, which is disrupting established and comfortable processes. So change management happens all the time. You may not even be aware that you're practicing change management skills. So for example, a large scale change is implementing a brand new accessibility system where you QA all new products before they roll into production and go into the hands of customers. A very, very small scale change is something like painting your living room, which is a project I got to enjoy over the summer. But change management, you have to plan what you're going to do. You have to buy the paint, you have to put up the painter's tape, you have to make sure that you have brushes. And then when something comes in and disrupts your process, say running out of paint, you also have to factor in some time to go to the store. It's change, so it takes planning and effort. And then the other things that you have to remember with, especially with large scale change management, is that people are change averse. There's change inertia and there's distrust. People don't want to change. It feels really scary to make changes. It's shaking them out of something that's normal for them, giving them a new way to go. So you have to be mindful of that and to remember, people aren't going to move as quickly as you want them to. You already know where we're going, but they also don't need to move quite as slowly as they want to either. So now let's talk about some successful change management techniques. There are three things that I see as the most valuable for successful change management, and they are communication, psychological safety, and personal transparency and vulnerability. So we need to tell people not just what's coming up, we need to tell people what's already being done, what we're currently in the process of doing, and also what's coming. I don't think that change needs to be just us imposing what we want to have happen onto whoever we're working with. In this case, I'm going to keep using the example of developers because this is a developer geared track. They know what they're doing. They can see where we're going. And it can be really challenging to kind of bridge that gap and just say, how do I take part in this change process? So that's not something being done to me, but something that I'm participating in. And then psychological safety and personal transparency and vulnerability to me go hand in hand. You establish trust. That's the whole point of change management, is establishing trust. And you can do that by practicing transparency and vulnerability. This helps reinforce psychological safety. So helping people feel comfortable sharing their own concerns, their anger, their questions. Human emotions are human. Help people express them appropriately and constructively. All right, so then how do we balance accessibility goals in all of this? Business goals regarding accessibility, they're often very concrete. For example, all customer-facing user interfaces must be accessible by end of year 2024. Ambitious, also very concrete. The goal for accessibility champions is to effect lasting change so that we don't neglect accessibility in the next project. Balancing these two goals, business goals versus cultural changes, it can be really challenging because they don't necessarily pull in the same direction, or they don't always feel like they're pulling in the same direction. In places across different businesses, I've seen that the business side of things can perceive accessibility champions as a little fluffy, not caring about deadlines because we really are pushing an accessibility agenda. But accessibility champions, in turn, can perceive business as very cold and caring more about the bottom line than users. And business wants deliverables and metrics. Part of accessibility and tracking is what we didn't find. So no lawsuits, no errors. We can pull together a lot better using the +1 method. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So here's been the setup. Now we're going to talk about +1. What is it and how do we use it? So I have a Fibonacci spiral on the screen here. And I really like it because math is not my strong suit. So this is near and dear to my heart that I understand it. But the idea of adding something onto itself, adding something onto itself +1, how do we continue to build a bigger and bigger impact until we've got something exponentially bigger than what we started with? So, all right, I have a graphic up on the screen and I made it myself. So you'll have to forgive it a little bit. It is an arrow left to right, and then it has different circles on the arrow that are meant to be like stopping points. And then there are cycles. They look kind of like the recycling symbols, a wheel with arrows in it. So what do these things mean? Project goals is our arrow that moves left to right. Project goals tend to go in one direction. We start a project and we end it somewhere. Milestones are the circles on the arrow, things that we learn along the way, things that we want to check off to say we're making progress. And then in the middle of, in between each milestone, there's this iterative process where we implement something, learn from it, and make plans to move on to make it better in the next section. All right, so what is the +1 method? Identifying the goal. So I talk about constants and linear effort here. The constant is the product or the project goal. Typically, it's defined by business. That's the thing that we're always moving towards. So I call it a constant because we're always moving in that direction. Linear effort is our current work towards the goal, and it's measured in milestones. So for example, a goal might be user interface accessibility for all customer-facing experiences. What we're currently doing for the goal is maybe semantic HTML elements used consistently. So then what's the iterative effort? That's the circle of arrows. It's identifying gaps, identifying concrete steps to meet the gap, and demonstrating the relationship between the step and the gap. And this is where +1 really comes in. So we might say the gap is that buttons don't have accessible names consistently. So a concrete step to meet that is, let's do 30-minute knowledge transfers about ARIA labels. And then tying the concrete step to what is already being done is, we're already using the name attribute. Let's add something similar in the form of ARIA labels, but that has slightly different properties. So the idea of grouping all of this together, the arrow, the linear effort plus the milestones plus the iteration, we're consistently iterating through gap analysis, step identification, and current work tie-in, while also moving towards the product or project goal. This is keeping both our long-term goals and our short-term goals in mind. So when we put it all together, that's what we get. All right, before I move on, I just want to make one really important note. The +1 method doesn't mean that we always begin at the basics, or what we as accessibility professionals would consider the lowest hanging fruit. The lowest hanging fruit in the context of +1 is whatever technique builds most closely on our current practices. For example, we wouldn't normally start by explaining ARIA labels to somebody new to accessibility. However, if a team is already in the practice of writing names for buttons, adding ARIA labels might be a logical and easy +1. So how does this relate to Agile? I'm a big fan of the Agile framework. I learned it, oh gosh, a couple of years ago, and I'm a big fan for how it can partner with accessibility. So let's talk about how that happens. One way is through sprints and iterations. So we can leverage the Agile sprint and iteration process, that idea of cycling through the iterations as we move towards a goal, and we hit the milestones along the way. Milestones are like ending of our sprints. That's like the ends of our iterations. We can build accessibility acceptance criteria and defects into our backlog and sprint planning. Those can be part of our user stories. Those can be part of our defect log. And then we can add one new accessibility idea per sprint. So that's our +1. And then keep remediation of any defects that we find as very iterative and very granular. This makes accessibility really scalable because you're tackling one small idea at a time. Again, this is the ideal world. However, you can ramp up the pace as needed. You can keep the accessibility ideas directly relevant to work. So you could do like +1 per user story or +1 per section of your page. Using +1 in tandem with Agile gives you a lot more control over the pace with which you're sharing accessibility. And it helps you keep from trying to remediate the entire build or the entire process or flow at one time. It's a lot easier to identify where things are breaking down and to see where more support is needed. Finally, for the purposes of iteration demos or sprint demos, you can show how accessibility directly applies to your sprint work. And also you can extrapolate it to be a repeatable process. All right, so +1 as change management. Change inertia is one of the biggest things that we as change management practitioners need to overcome. Accessibility subject matter experts are rarely brought in at the beginning of a build. We talked about that right off the bat. One thing I found is that it can feel to developers like it's an attack or a harsh criticism if we walk in and say, yep, I've audited this. Here's all the issues that I found. Here's all the defects you need to fix. Go fix it. One of the problems is that business stakeholders often just want to see the defects because they want to see how much technical debt are we going to have as a result of accessibility. It ends up being not the greatest way to present it overall to the development teams. New ideas, they feel like an attack on a well-oiled machine. And these changes feel like they're going to be giant swings in our practice instead of tiny course corrections. So what are the benefits of plus one? It gives us the chance to introduce new ideas slowly so they don't feel as aggressive. It also, and this is something really important to me, it helps people recognize that they're already practicing a lot of the techniques that we want. So remember that idea of like add on one thing to what people are already doing. And that requires you as the accessibility professional to recognize what people are doing. It creates knowledge transfer opportunities because there are little teaching moments. Every time you explain how something that's already being done aligns to future goals, you're creating a little teaching moment. Every course correction is also a teaching moment. Plus one reminds us to be positive. It's really easy to shoot down ideas or strategies or approaches because you need to get to a certain outcome. So you want everyone to do it a certain way. That might be the ultimate goal, is to have everybody using ARIA labels correctly. However, going in and telling people only about how they're doing it wrong, not the best way to win them over. It undermines trust. It blocks people from learning because they don't feel safe to make mistakes. And mistakes are a foundation of learning. By forcing us to identify what's already happening and going well, change becomes a way to build on the positive and create further positive outcomes. Both are ways to get the job done. We can just get everybody to do it the way we want to do it. But if we create this positive environment, it's a lot more likely that change is going to stick and that we'll be able to replicate it. And then the big key is building partnership. When you come in as a subject matter expert, and expert is in the title, people tend to expect you to just take over and tell them what to do, and that is not partnership. Following plus one can lean towards patronizing if you aren't genuine, but if you are genuine, then you can teach about your small piece and also let others share their expertise. Then you can figure out how to partner to go forward and use everybody's strengths. Plus one isn't necessarily top down. So even though you're introducing a new idea, you're not just telling everybody exactly how to do it. Not being top down means it's easier to be us, the team and the SME, versus the problem, which is inaccessibility, instead of the team versus me versus the problem. That's not a partnership, and it's not really going to solve the actual issue. So us instead of us versus them. All righty. So going to talk about ownership and the accessibility SME. We get lots of questions about all of this. What's your job? What happens if we don't have you as the SME coming in? If we have a SME, we don't really have to learn anything, right? All right, so let's talk about the impact each of those questions has. What is the subject matter expert meant to do long-term for the team or for the build? Are they tied to the product, tied to the team, tied to the organization? It can feel like the accessibility SME is an accessibility cop. So like a speed trap effect. They're just waiting for me to make a mistake and they're always watching for me. Or as like the elite person in their ivory tower, they have tons of knowledge and resources, but they're not sharing with anybody else. It's really not quite the partnership mindset that we're going for. I also get a lot of questions. Well, what do we do if we don't have a SME? We're just going to guess and hope that we get it right. Which I love the spirit of going and researching for yourself, figuring out what's going on. But I also hate when I have to ask somebody to do rework because it's not done in an accessible way. So again, back to that idea of partnership. And then if we have an accessibility SME, we don't have to learn accessibility, right? This person has some made up rules, they're not communicating, so we obviously don't have to do it. Not quite. We ultimately want people to take ownership of this. So development teams at the end of the day shouldn't even need the accessibility SME anymore. They should be the accessibility experts themselves. And the end result is that the accessibility SME can come across as being the bad guy or bad cop. So we're trying to break down that mindset. And that comes in when we start talking about accessibility, accountability, and your role as part of an agile team. So the agile framework has built-in accountability, right? Every role has its job. So like the product owner accepts all of the stories, sets out the big vision and strategy for the team. The business analyst writes the requirements, make sure that everybody's understanding things as we go along. The designer does the look and feel of everything. The developers do the actual code. The QAs check against everything that we've written down and make sure that it's going the way we want it to go. Accessibility can be added to that accountability framework. We can say, okay, the PO practices accessibility by making sure that all accepted stories have been tested for accessibility and are working the way we expect. The designer can check for accessibility, have that accountability by, say, making sure all the buttons have names before they hand off the designs. The BA writes requirements for all the button names. The developer implements the buttons with those names. The QA checks that all that happened with the functionality. Then we finally accept it. So you can see how Agile and its accountability can be harnessed for accessibility. So what happens when somebody doesn't do it? What happens when one role decides they're not going to practice accessibility? It adds time, it adds overtime, it can be moved deadlines, it just adds so much more rework. It adds cost, whether it's in paying people for overtime or having to spend time on defects, which is cost to the build overall. And then it adds tech debt. Point carryover, you can't accept stories if all the accessibility acceptance criteria aren't met. It creates more work in the future. So, what is the role of the SME? The SME should be doing the heavy lifting at the beginning. You can't expect people to go in and do accessibility. I'm putting that in air quotes. You can't expect people to go in and start practicing accessibility if they have never heard of it. You have to be introducing these concepts yourself. We're going to talk a little bit about the idea of scaffolding people towards independence. But what this looks like is like guiding your BAs through story writing, helping devs make decisions, QAing alongside the QAs, and then helping give that green light for acceptance. Again, not where you're going to stay forever, but where you need to be in the beginning. So as SMEs, how do we get our message across and create buy-in? This is where +1 comes in. Leverage the existing resources and work that's already out there. So works in progress, completed projects that have already been audited for accessibility, designs and wireframes with accessibility annotations built in. Use what you have. And that's tying it back to those concrete things that are already being practiced. Identify where accessibility is already built in. So this is saying, where are we? What are we currently doing and doing well? And then +1, show how new accessibility ideas build on the existing practices. Use something people already understand, again, even if it's not the most low-hanging fruit. So like if everyone knows about alternative text, but not headings, start with alternative text. It gives the brain a hook for this new idea. It's associating something new with something that's already known. All right, and here we're talking about scaffolding. This is an example of how you can do it. I have, I think, 5 steps in my scaffold. You can have more or less, it doesn't really matter. But for me, the ground floor is that I teach and I demonstrate. So like standing up in front of everybody, sharing accessibility principles, showing what examples of really successfully practiced accessibility look like, and also what happens if we don't practice it. The first level to me is that the accessibility SME works alongside the team. So going to all of the ceremonies, working on every story, walking through every piece of code that's written. The second level, this is where I get really excited as the accessibility SME, because the team is now doing the leading and I'm doing the mentoring. That means your BA is writing the stories and I might come in and make some suggestions. The developers are doing the code and I might put my hand in and say, oh, we really need to remember this. That third level, the team leads and I just watch. I'm there to provide support. I'm there to be the safety net. not really needed anymore. And that to me is like a sweet spot because I love getting to watch the team work on what they do, and to watch them practice these what were previously new and scary ideas, and to do it so well. And then the fourth level to me is a little sad, bittersweet, I should say, because the team's independent and I'm not needed anymore. I roll off, I go work with another crew, and we start the whole thing over again. So let's talk about some strategies as we're walking through that scaffold. How do we actually get from the ground floor all the way up to the top? I've got 3 strategies that I want to talk about. HTML best practices, user stories with functional and accessibility AC, and knowledge transfers and resources. And I run them all at the same time. All right, first thing, HTML best practices. HTML is inherently accessible. All web-generated user interfaces are underpinned by HTML. We have a DOM order, and all of this is the basis for custom work. So just bare bones, what we have with HTML, and then a lot of what we have like React and Angular, that can be made inherently accessible. If we use the bare bones, we'll get there. So stressing that we shouldn't be straying from HTML best practices, and that'll get us part of the way to accessibility. User stories and acceptance criteria. So I've noticed a trend where development crews tend to think of accessibility as nice to haves, not need to haves, where we know that accessibility, they're functional requirements. If you don't do accessibility, that means somebody is not going to be able to use your site or your app or whatever it is. So helping to get that idea across that accessibility AC are functional AC. We should have one user story for all functional AC in a specific implementation. Reusable components are something I'm still thinking about. Sometimes we split out accessibility when we're creating something to be replicated across the organization. I'm going to say that that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about very concrete ideas, but I know the question's going to come up if I don't mention it. And then knowledge transfers and resources. So I like to do really bite-sized knowledge transfers, a couple times a week, keep them really, really, really short. Less than 20 minutes of teaching, 10 minutes for questions. Give a ton of different opportunities for resources where people can get them in whatever modality that they need. So I personally am a text-based person. I like everything visual and I don't like videos. So I would much rather have an article with screenshots of what it's supposed to look like than I would a video. Some people do really, really well with very short meetings where they can ask a lot of questions and see something demoed. Some people would way rather watch the video afterwards, and that's fine. But give all these opportunities to people. Give some pretty like heavy lifting resources, like a component library with accompanying accessibility acceptance criteria. Match those things up. Take a lot of that hard work away for the BAs. Give your QAs a process and a template. Try to hook into what they're already doing in terms of automation and manual testing. Build that in and help them to appropriately size that so they can build it into their end-to-end testing and their iteration testing. And make sure everybody can find it. A lot of the time our accessibility resources get buried. Make sure that everybody has the links to a central repository for all of this. So then, takeaways. What have I learned from all of this? Here's some important ideas for sustainability and scalability. Use your past work. Document everything that went right and wrong. There's going to be a lot that you can learn from the things that have already been done. Whether it went well, whether it didn't go well, it doesn't matter. You can learn something from it. So make sure that what you've learned, accessibility related or not, that you do a retro at the end of it and say, here's where we can do better in the future, or here's what we can leverage and now use it in an accessibility to further accessibility as we go along. And look at your key takeaways for your future improvement. So even if this went really well, this was a good technique, we liked this technique, how can we level it up for the next build? And then ask questions. Don't just guess or assume. Many times I will see different roles have questions, or I'll have questions. And I think the temptation for all of us is to say, I'm going to look foolish, or I'm going to look inexperienced or silly if I have to ask a question about that. And I find that's really not the case, not just for accessibility, but for Agile in general. It can be really challenging to say that you don't know something. I think it makes us feel like we're incompetent. I think this is a very human thing. But when we can extend that vulnerability to each other to say, like, I might be an expert on this one thing, but I'm not on other things over here, I think that goes a really long way towards establishing trust. And I think it also goes a long way towards us practicing accessibility, not just saying, I have to get it perfect the very first time around. Or I'm going to pretend that I know what's happening so I don't look like silly in front of my team. And then it seems to fall apart really quickly when there are defects that we log afterwards. People get very defensive, but we don't need to do that. If we ask questions, all of us ask questions and don't just guess at things, it helps us establish our roles and responsibilities better, and it helps us build our depth and breadth of knowledge about the build, about accessibility. So then what's the end goal? The end goal is you don't need me anymore. Teams feel comfortable making accessibility decisions independently. So your plus ones add up. The first time around, this me is going to do most of the work. You're going to be the guide. You're going to blaze the trail for everybody else, because remember, you're an expert in it, but they've never seen it before. This might be the first time that the devs have ever heard of accessibility. Screen readers are going to be new. Testing tools are going to be new. This whole idea that accessibility is built in, you don't really have to add a ton necessarily. Brand new idea. The second time around, the crew kind of knows what they're doing a little bit. They have an idea. You still help them quite a bit. You're not turning them loose to do all of this on their own. That's not very fair to them or to you. It makes everybody feel like they're failing at it. The third time around, the crew leads. You're there to be the safety net. And that's a really great place, watching people succeed with the tools that you've helped provide. And then minimal support. The whole idea is scaffolding towards independence. How can you do this alone? And that's what plus one is really for. How do you build on what currently exists till you hit a point of complete independence? Think of it like a pyramid. It starts as a tiny rock in the middle, right? You build out, you build up, you build around. And that's the whole idea. And no one can get there by themselves, right? Like you can, as an accessibility SME, you probably have done a lot of this, like solo work, right? Whether it's going to these seminars, going to classes, taking your exams. Teams aren't necessarily doing it the same way. You can help them feel a lot more connected to our community and to our practice and body of knowledge. All right, so now there's time for questions. I have my thank you, my closeout slide up here. It has my email address on it. If we don't get to your question, or if you want to talk about this further, please feel free to email me. My email is kweberho@travelers.com. And you can, of course, find me on LinkedIn. Message me. Feel free to add me as a connection. I'm looking forward to continuing to talking with all of you about this. So, Phil, what questions, if any, do we have?
Catherine, 36 minutes after the hour, you are right on time. And then some. This is great. It gives us a chance to take these questions. Really, if you get this much commenting going on during your talk where frustrations are coming out, which I'm seeing here, I think you're doing something that's resonating. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of talk about what people experience in their
Yep,
work, because obviously we have folks who are already in the space, and that's
yep,
what this con's all about. I'm going to read you a few comments first before some questions.
please.
Okay. Kevin said, um, too many times I've found it's too easy for teams to push accessibility off to later.
Yeah. Kevin, I feel your pain on this one. That is often where I land. Um, I think if you get the chance to work on multiple builds with the same organization, I can tell you it does get better, but that those first couple, it's difficult and I feel your pain.
Nathan said, my goal is to help make the rest of the developers on our team part of the process by giving them training and
Mhm.
tools and then having them review other devs' code with a safety net, pulling in
Yep.
experts when they feel out of depth. That's my plus one smile.
I love it. I really love that. Because, yeah, that's the point of scalability, right? There's only one of you. I mean, in my case, I'm really fortunate to be at an organization where there's two of us. I know a lot of people who are all by themselves at their organizations. How are you supposed to create a broad spread accessibility initiative? It's exactly like that by teaching other people, training them till they become comfortable, and then they spread out. Um, and it does help create this whole accessibility program, whether or not that's what you're tasked to have done. But I suspect that is what you've been tasked to do.
Thank you. One other one here that's a comment leading to a question. Faye said, I love reusable components, but if you don't make it right the first time, I'm coming for you.
Hey, that's incredible. I love
I,
it.
I want to give you
Um,
this question, if I may. Let's
yes,
just
please.
follow that up. So, some folks who are new to accessibility may think that design systems or component library type things will
Mhm.
let's key on design systems.
Yes,
You're
let's talk
fortunate
about
to
it.
know about those. Um, that that it's going to be handled. A developer might think, well, that's accessibility is included, isn't it? And it's built in, and it won't take any more work from me or any thought.
Mhm.
Have you seen that, and explain how that can fail, or counting on that design system to be, watertight may run you
Yep.
foul.
So this is a topic near and dear to my heart. So I really appreciate whoever set this question up for me. Design systems. I love them. I really love them. Honestly, one of the core things that I rely on a day-to-day basis is a design system, a component system that has so many of these possibilities built in. But remember that your design system, it's like it's your vanilla ice cream and you're meant to add toppings onto it. It's your base. Custom components get built on top of it or using your design system as its foundation. So like riffing on a theme. Um, for example, your design system might have tables built a certain way, and your team needs to do something a little bit different with it. It's up to your team to still make sure that it's accessible. You can have all of the base attributes or the base ideas built into your component, but if you're not using that component, taking into account all of those accessibility features, it's not going to end up accessible in your implementation. So I think it comes down to like, yes, having an accessible design system, absolutely. Having an accessible component library, that's really key. But you also have to know how to leverage that appropriately. And that's where the individual knowledge comes in. That's why I can see the temptation very much to say, well, that's the design system's responsibility. As long as I'm using the design system, I don't have to do anything else. And that's not really true. It's still your responsibility as the individual developer or the designer or the QA to make sure that you're implementing it in an accessible way. The other thing that I want everyone to keep in mind is that just because something functions accessibly in isolation does not mean that when you drop it in the page, it's going to do the same thing. So that's why it's so important to do end-to-end testing. It doesn't really matter if your button is accessible if when you click on it, nothing happens, or if you activate it with a keyboard, nothing happens. doesn't matter. And accessibility is functional requirements, as we talked about. So
Nice.
I love a good design system. And I'm very impressed by the people who make them and make them so flexible.
Thank you. Here's a question that was, I think, got the most upvotes. So let's do Brandon's next. How do we pick our +1 starting point? Should we start with accessibility basics like headings?
So I think there are a couple of different schools of thought in the accessibility world. I've practiced both methods, so I feel uniquely positioned to get to talk about this. We have our accessibility basics, like our intro to accessibility courses. But I think a lot of times they're geared towards people who don't know anything at all about accessibility and also aren't developers. So we talk about things like color contrast or alt text. We talk about things like headings. Those aren't necessarily the things that our developers are thinking about. Our developers are thinking about, how does something function? How do I hook this data source into to populate the right information into my user portal? Or how do I get a button to do a certain thing when I activate it? Hook onto those things. If you don't have any images in your user interface or any like informative images, that's probably not going to be the best place for you to start, because there's going to be no point of reference. If there's no point of reference and you're not applying what you're learning right away, it's never going to stick in your head. So I think we talked about using ARIA labels for buttons. Not the most intuitive thing. ARIA labels I think of as like an advanced accessibility practice. These aren't the things you learn right away. But if you already know how to name buttons, learning when to put in ARIA labels for your buttons, not such a big step. So I think that where you start on your +1 journey depends on where your specific team is. And it's going to be different for every team. So I want you to keep that in mind. There's no one size fits all. There's no one starting place for every team. And I think that's important for you to grow as an accessibility SME, is what you learn from this one team, you can apply to the next one. But remember, they may not be starting in the same spot. Kind of like kids. Your first kid may be nothing like your second kid, and your third kid may be nothing like that. It's important to care for the child how they are. It's important to care for your team how it is, and not be prescribing a certain path or a certain content order for them.
Thank you. So like if it's a form-based flow, an app, with no images, key on forms.
Exactly. It's like your text input's going to be the most important. Let's talk about that first. And images, we'll get to it when you're putting together like a photo gallery or something.
Okay, here's a question. Got some votes. It says, we encourage our devs to iterate on their accessibility knowledge with each project, but it seems like only a handful of them actually do. Is there a way to enforce or better mandate at the organizational level? And, she says, I can't be on every project to monitor this.
Yeah, totally. I hear the word enforce or mandate, and it makes me pause, because I think that language comes back to the whole accessibility cop idea. The reason I'm focusing on that first is because I think the way to get people to really buy in more universally to accessibility is to recognize and celebrate the folks who are doing that. I know my tendency can be to say, no, that person's not, and that person's not. And I had to really make a conscious effort to turn around and say, but that person is, and that person is. So when the next developer comes to me and says, I don't know anything about this, I really messed this up, I can say, go talk to them. They know everything there is to know about this one user interface and how to make it accessible. They're doing something. Go see what they know. And if there's still questions, they can bring it back to me and we'll troubleshoot them together. We are always spread too thin as accessibility professionals, right? That seems to be a chronic problem in our community. I think that by demonstrating to other people, recognizing them, praising them for the work that they are doing, I think that helps us bring more people into our group. And it helps them with their sphere of influence go out and continue to share it and say, look what I'm doing.
Beautiful. Following up as a SME, how can I get better buy-in for bringing me into a project earlier in the process?
Ask questions and make friends. It can be challenging. I'm not going to pretend like it's not difficult. And I'm also not going to pretend like I get brought in on every conversation that I want to be in on. I'm finding that building relationships with people apart from the accessibility work that I do has been a huge asset. And that's like people who I chat with on Teams, people who I do video calls with. Going to my teams, like if we do a happy hour or something, or if someone's celebrating the launch of a new product, I go to this, I say, good job, and make friends, chat with people. And then the next time that we have an accessibility question, or there's a project where accessibility needs to get in, they say, oh yeah, I know her. We should probably ask her about this. And I'm finding that those informal connections are a big way to, one, make yourself feel less scary. So accessibility is not out there. It's some scary person who's going to come in and tell me I'm wrong. It's that woman over there. She sits down the hall. We had a drink together. And then they come get me. So build up the relationships wherever you can. That's going to be, to my mind, the key to getting the accessibility mission, vision, and practice across.
Next one. I mean, I have time for one or two more.
Yep.
Flora asked, with the +1 strategy coming from the first level, how long would you say the journey is to reach autonomy and from your experience, and what is the journey to switch from one level to another?
Yeah. I wish I had a concrete answer for you. You can set a particular amount of time for it. I tend not to, but I also know it's a big luxury to not have to set a really tight time box around it. I've seen groups try to do it in 6 months. I personally am on the side that likes to take a couple of years for it. And I know that reality is somewhere usually in the middle. Getting from one level to the next, I feel like it's kind of like when you want to take the training wheels off your bike, you're kind of ready to do it. You know that you're like not wobbling that much when you're riding the bike anymore. The training wheels aren't super relevant. And it's like, okay, I've kind of outgrown this. I think it's time to take them off. They'll let you know when they're ready. They'll stop needing you. They won't need you to talk in every single meeting. They'll start showing that they know what they're doing. They know what they're talking about. And I don't think it needs to be a formal, like, hey, you're transitioning from level 1 to level 2. It's like, I'm just going to fade out a little bit and fade out a little bit more until it's like, they'll call you up for a meeting. You'll say, no, you got this. You're fine. You don't really need me. And that's a very bittersweet moment, I'd say.
Lovely, lovely. Catherine, let's get one more in here.
Right.
Knowledge sessions 2 times a week, Joppy asks. It seems like a lot. Do you have things prepared beforehand, or is it seat in the pants?
No, I'm a prepper. I prepped like maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 slides, and I would cover one topic. So like one session, I think all I talked about was like semantics, so headings and lists, something like that. Or I would talk just about like, here's what it sounds like to have one screen reader read one thing. Very, very short, very focused, and something that I could say, go practice. Go look at your headings. Go practice with NVDA. So it seems like a lot, but you're trying to get across a lot of different concepts. And half an hour is something that a developer can spare, where a 3-hour block to get all of it in at once, maybe not.
All right. This puts us at the end. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you to the community who attended. Just to close this out, I want to say a friendly reminder, you can continue the conversation on our community Discord. If you haven't already, you can join via the link posted in chat. But be sure to also share your experiences on socials using the hashtag AXECON, XCON. again, wonderful session. Thank you. And Catherine also made the gesture to email her with your other questions.